really delighted to be joined by a panel of researchers from King's College London to talk about the research perspective on AI and data governance. Journal policy with regards to AI is largely focused on the use of Gen AI tools in the context of writing a paper, supporting authors and expressing content in non-native language, and more broadly enhancing idea generation and exploration. But how is AI being studied within academia? What should we be thinking about with regards to the data sets created as part of the research process which underpin the article, particularly with regards to AI disclosure, data privacy, the potential for algorithmic bias, and more. So today's panel will reference financial, medical, and environmental domains, focusing on what are the guardrails around AI to mitigate bias and other harms, what are the ethical considerations when building and deploying these AI technologies. And we'll also reflect on the trustworthiness of research and what this might mean for future editorial policy. We're probably getting distracted by the poll, which we'll get to in a second. But before we get to that, I just wanted to let our panel introduce themselves and just share a little bit about their research and their interests. So, Sophia.
Hi, I was introduced as a researcher at the Open Data Institute, a non-profit based here in London. That's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. But I've now also started a PhD, which I am doing full-time, so part-time at the Open Data Institute, where I'm a PhD student in computer sciences, but focusing on understanding the organizational barriers to data ethics practices within a Centre for Doctoral Training on Safe and Trusted AI, which Mackenzie's also a part of. So my background very much focuses on topics across data governance policy, worked at the ODI and research and policy teams, kind of focusing on the social scientific approach to the sciences, master's focusing on kind of environmental domain and environmental data governance, and my bachelor's focusing on health and public health.
Cool. Hi everybody, super excited to be here. My name is Mackenzie. I'm in my last few months of my PhD, so in the 4th year, and I'm studying computer science. My background's in computer science and philosophy, and the research that I'm working on is trying to mitigate bias in AI classification systems, and then considering from those methods, how are they legal or maybe illegal under the UK's Equality Act. And I've always had a bit of a passion for human rights, and so doing this kind of research that's bridging AI, ethics, society, really just was quite the natural focus for my PhD. And interdisciplinary research is what I'm most passionate about, so I want to keep doing that.
And I'm Tiarna. I'm doing my PhD in biomedical engineering, but specifically looking at fairness in AI for cardiac imaging. A lot of people don't think of AI being part of engineering or how it can be applied to medicine, and I'm just watching the word cloud come up. It's very entertaining. But yeah, that's what I work on, specifically looking at how can we make AI fair for all the people we apply it to, whether it's ethnic minorities, whether it's women, whether it's older people, and how to mitigate biases that we see there.
Great, thanks everyone. And sorry, I didn't realise my mic wasn't working before, so I'm not sure if anyone heard my mumblings, but we'll move straight on anyway. Before we dive into the questions, we just wanted to take a bit of a temperature check and give some context actually to the panel who, first time at a publishing conference. So it's great to see your feelings about AI in general coming up here. We wanted to sort of see whether you like AI, whether you're excited about it, sort of what's that looking like. And there's quite a mix, actually, isn't there, in terms of, sort of negative and positives there, which I think is probably to be expected. If we could just go on to the next question in Mentimeter. I don't know whether anyone's got access to that or whether I can do it. So the next question that will be coming up in a second is, what applications of AI are becoming popular in the disciplines you publish in? So just thinking about the areas and the communities you publish with, and what applications are becoming popular there. Yeah, peer review coming out loud and clear in the centre there. Regs on curated conscious. Interesting. Great. Well, thanks for that, everyone. I think that gives a bit of context for the panel as we sort of dive into the questions. But as we're talking about data governance, we wanted to start off with a question about terminology. What is AI and what isn't AI? Just to be really clear on that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll take that one. And so in academia and industry and government, like we hear AI spoken about quite a lot. Like we've had a lot of different topics at this conference discussing it as well. So we just want to start it off with the clear definition. So as a researcher, we think of AI as being, there's a part that's knowledge-based. So the knowledge-based AI is typically like good old-fashioned AI. And these are systems that are built with logic. They're very black and white. Versus, I think oftentimes when we think about AI in today's age, we're thinking about data-driven AI. And so that's more machine learning, which is systems that are built like with bunches and bunches of data. And especially with the rise of generative AI, that's much more along the lines of data-driven AI. So those are kind of the two different streams of AI that I think we'll be discussing today, but more so along the lines of the data-driven AI in this discussion. And I'd also just add AI at the end of the day is just a tool, it's a technology. It doesn't think like we do, even though some people think it might, but as a researcher I can tell you it doesn't. And it's not necessarily better than what you or I could do. That's another thing I want to make clear, and just hopefully that we won't be anthropomorphizing AI is another important thing. It is just a tool, it is just a technology at the end of the day.
Great, thank you. And how do you see AI benefiting and causing problems or harms within society and within your own work more specifically? And Tiarna, perhaps you could share your thoughts on that.
One of the things that I focus on is bias. So all different types of bias, whether it's the data that you collect, whether it's how you use it, and who it's applied to. And one of the main sort of problems that I see arising is that we don't measure bias enough, and we don't know where it's necessarily coming from. So for example, in my work, I look at bias in terms of data collection. I use the heart images of subjects, and for a long time, people weren't collecting any information on demographics, so you had no idea who was in their data set. And so I see the same thing sort of propagating across all sorts of uses of AI, who we apply it to, and are we applying it in the right ways?
Thank you. Mackenzie?
Yeah, in my work, I usually look at the financial use cases, so thinking about risk scores with respect to credit scores, and then also should banks be giving loans to people? And oftentimes with this, we're dealing with historical data, which has plenty of bias within it against people of color and women most often. So these are issues, I guess, where we're assuming that the financial sector will continue to be using these AI systems. So we're just trying to create research and mitigation methods to try to, I guess, mitigate that bias as much as we can. And I think Tiarna gave a great example of the medical image domain, but risk scores are also used in the healthcare domain, which is another big field where we're trying to predict, okay, who will need more checks, who will need more support in the future. And it's a big challenge in machine learning because we don't necessarily know the future, right? We don't necessarily have the true labels. So we really are just having to go off of predictions.
Sophia?
So I started out, I guess, in more of a kind of environmental domain where questions are often very much like who gets to measure, who gets to adopt certain technologies, all those kinds of things. But now I've ended up a little bit without a domain, but more focusing on the kind of like governance and infrastructure side, I guess. And so my angle maybe is framed a little bit by that. But I think in some cases it's worth having some trust that there are people working in very thoughtful ways to build kind of governance mechanisms around applications of AI that they're investing in. So for example, at the Open Data Institute, we've kind of worked together with an initiative called Insight, where at Moorfields Eye Hospital, they're kind of building a data trust, working together with patients to basically looking towards a goal of being able to build predictive approaches to understanding like genetic profiles in age-related macular degeneration, so a very common eye disease. And I guess the point that I'm sort of working towards is in some cases kind of starting with the problem and working from there and kind of thinking, well, we have a problem, we need a tool, and then we'll build our governance mechanisms from there, and we'll work upwards. We'll think what data we need, who do we need to ask for that, how do we work together with those people, and I'm feeling relatively optimistic about those kinds of cases. And I think the flip side, I'm sure many of you kind of engaged in these kinds of discussions as well, but the flip side is the sort of like, here's the solution, now where's the problem type approach, which I think is kind of inherently very problematic and very concerning, because how can you possibly start to have sort of like that inclusivity by design and have the right people in the room when you're developing governance approaches if you're kind of starting with a tool and then casting around for how that can kind of be implemented in practice, and you're starting way too late in the design process and in the governance process.
I think that certainly chimes with some of what we heard this morning. Well, generally, what do you consider to be the biggest challenges and opportunities in relation to AI and data governance, obviously drawing on your experiences in your research? Tiarna?
I think, and from the word cloud, I think one of the things people are most concerned about is how it's going to be used. I assume people are mostly considering things like ChatGPT and large language models. I see a few nods. And I saw a few words like it's fraud and knockoff. And I think this is one of the things that I think is one of the biggest challenges, is that there's a kind of misunderstanding about, like Mackenzie said, that it's a tool and it's how it's used, not kind of what it is. So at the very base level, ChatGPT is just drawing on a load of different sources that it has to produce an output that, in my opinion, I think given enough time, most people could find by themselves. But it's a time-saving tool. And I think one of the challenges is knowing how to use it, how to govern it to make sure that it's not used in the wrong applications, and how to explain that it is just a tool. Just like let me tell a story. I always use the example of when cars started to replace horses. Everyone was really scared. They said these horses' carriages are going to transform the world and we don't like it. And then over the time, cars became more and more popular. But what happened was that legislation was always falling behind. So we didn't have seatbelts, we didn't have speed limits, and more people were dying. Whereas as soon as they started implementing these regulations, it was safe to use cars, safe-ish. So I think I see the same thing happening with AI, is that we need to stay ahead of the curve with regulations, and that will make it a lot safer to use in the future.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, I definitely want to echo Tiarna's point there about just like AI literacy and understanding like what it is and like what, I guess, what applications we're using it for, and maybe what ones we shouldn't be using it for as well, from a more like ethical societal impact point of view. And I hope that over time, and as we have conferences like this today, that becomes much more clear. And with respect to the opportunity, and you already touched on this, I do think regulation right now with AI is very exciting, and there's a lot going on in Brussels with the EU AI Act, and this is very much a horizontal, like very broad regulation, but I think with time we're going to have more and more vertical-based, so like sector-based, domain-specific regulation, which is going to be very impactful. So I think like keep an eye out, it's definitely an exciting space. But I think another example would be the pharmaceutical industry used to kind of have a lot of free reign, and then governments are like, whoa, we need to have some more regulation and guardrails around this. And I think that's kind of the stage we're at with AI right now. And I'm excited to see where it goes from here.
Anything else you'd like to add, Sophia?
So I think, you guys have been talking about sort of like guardrails, and I saw a lot of the typical kind of like caution, concern, and something that I've seen a lot in the work that I've been doing and the reading that I've been doing is this, or how I would describe it as like no man's land. So a lot of people working within organizations kind of working on sort of implementing a certain approach, an analytical approach or something like this, and kind of saying like, I use the golden rule of like, would I want my grandma to be affected by this technology? Not really having sort of clear guidance, not necessarily working within organizations where incentives are well aligned for them to be thinking clearly and in structured ways about their responsibilities relating to the work that they're doing, and then also on the other side, so in the domains that we work in, there is a kind of huge proliferation of sort of like technical fairness approaches to dealing with like bias, exactly the kind of work that you do, so like addressing like racial bias within data sets, etc. And there's like a huge kind of proliferation of like transparency documentation approaches and ethical guidelines and all of these kinds of things, and there's a bit of a kind of unclarity over what's proportionate to ask from organizations and what the likely best standard is like going to be. So among all of these things, there's so much noise but so little clarity about where the kind of the way out is. And so I think in terms of opportunities, like using regulation to create kind of shared language and standards, and investing in considering what those standards should look like, testing whether the approach that you're taking, for example, the ethical review process or something is working for you, these kinds of questions. So yeah, I think a kind of like equal and opposite energy to the chaos in a way.
Just thinking actually, such an interesting area, and I think relevant for this audience, thinking about, you know, the data that is generated through the research that ultimately gets published in a journal. And it'd be interesting to hear from all of you in terms of greater transparency, conversations that are happening around different data sets in your different disciplines. And I'm thinking, Tiarna, specifically, you know, some of the examples we've talked about in terms of medical imaging, it might be useful just to share a bit more about that and, you know, what you've seen in that area and what your research is looking at.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges in medical imaging and why people are kind of concerned about the use of AI is it really is life and death. You know, there's nothing sort of more important to people than their health. And so when you apply a model and you don't know what it's doing, it's obviously a cause for great concern. And one of the things that we found is that if you give a model an image and you ask it to classify, does this person, for example, from a chest x-ray, does this person have COVID, do they have pneumonia, it can do that very well. But also, it can predict a patient's race and it can predict their sex with like 95% accuracy, even though you didn't tell it to do that. And these are the sorts of like transparency issues that we're coming up against, because if it can infer someone's race, if like for a certain disease you have different prevalences, it might start cheating and doing that instead of actually classifying a disease. So I've been working on using transparency and kind of bias mitigation methods to try and see what these models are looking at and how we can prevent it from essentially cheating and using information that we haven't given it.
That's a fascinating area. I was just thinking as well, at King's, for example, are there guidelines for researchers around this yet, or is it too early?
Around transparency related to medical imaging?
Well, we could maybe talk about that in each sort of area of research interest, but yes.
So we have our guidelines in terms of patient data, where there's, you know, GDPR and keeping data safe. King's general AI policy. Well, I'll talk about my department specifically. We know that students are using AI for their coursework and for their exams. In fact, I've caught students using like ChatGPT for their coursework. And our policy is, in exams, it's just a straight no. But I do know that they're kind of considering, at least in my department, if the students are using this, should we have a transparency sort of notice and say you should declare what you use it for, or put in the prompts. And so there is a bit more of a discussion going on. Instead of a straight ban, if we know that students are using it already, what can we do to kind of try and curb that?
And just sort of going back to the question of transparency and ethical guidelines around what's happening within your research areas, what are you seeing there, Mackenzie?
I guess within the algorithmic fairness, AI ethics domains, we have things like model cards, we have things called data cards, and these are tools that people use to say, okay, these are the parameters we use, these are the models we used, these kind of classification systems or neural networks, what have you, and then with the data sets, just giving a very clear overview of, okay, where is this from? Like, how is it curated? These are the different questions we were asking as we were creating this. And then this is how we processed it before we then trained the model with it. So those are great tools that are out there. But I do think there are only so many open source data sets out there that we as researchers can actually use. And that's, I think, is a big issue because in industry, there's so much more data there. But we don't have access to that necessarily as academics and as researchers. So it's very hard, I think, to be able to properly study and understand what real practitioners are, what questions they're asking, and how they're actually adding in responsible AI guardrails, and I guess just figuring out how to operationalize principles like responsibility, transparency, explainability along the AI and machine learning pipeline. So that's definitely something we need to improve upon, I think. But of course, it's an industry's benefit, I think, to hold on to that data, of course. So it's definitely still a challenge, I would say.
I'm just wondering, Sophia, with your Open Data Institute hat on, is there anything you'd sort of add to that, about that challenge of getting access to, large enough and the relevant data sets for academics?
So, I mean, in the context of that work, I've done some research on sort of specific, basically access to, for example, social media platform data, which is a huge kind of politically contentious issue at the moment, and there's kind of pretty much a consensus that there absolutely should be researchers able to understand and access that data. Maybe I could ask what were you aiming for with the question?
I was just wondering about the National Library
the
idea.
National Data.
Yeah,
I see. All right. So just for context, there's currently a policy proposition. I don't think it's gone further than that. Maybe. I mean, I didn't read this white paper actually. But a proposition for a national data library where the UK government will kind of host a kind of a library of open data sets for research. And I guess possibly one of the most relevant points, and I know you've spoken about this in the past in relation to health data, is like that there's a huge difference between data that you can really use and that you can understand how you are allowed to use it and all of these kinds of things and the expense behind creating that data. And you were talking in another occasion about the UK Biobank and how the data ended up being right back from 2001 because updating that data and having different demographics behind the data is just a hugely intensive process. But my personal work is a little bit less on the open data side, ironically, despite the name.
So perhaps bringing this back to some of the publishing questions that stakeholders in the room may be grappling with, what are the implications potentially for journal and editorial policy with regards to the use of AI in conducting research? Sort of what are you seeing based on your research? What are the questions that are coming up in your mind?
Who'd you first?
I can go first. So I've spoken a lot about sort of ChatGPT because I think that's the new sort of thing that people the most worried about and what people know of the most. And I think, in my opinion, feel free to come and disagree with me later, but I don't think it generates anything necessarily new. I think it samples from data that it already has and spits out a result. And so I think, again, it's about regulating the use of it rather than trying to stop it entirely. I know you mentioned things about data. I think to me, in my work, that's the more sort of pressing issue, is that what data do we have and how are we using it? because that then will feed into models like ChatGPT. And if we make it fair right from the beginning, and the data sets that we're using, making sure they're representative, making sure they're governed well, that the people in them are protected, that will feed all the way down to the models that we eventually apply them to. So it's a whole pipeline of things that we need to sort of get right.
Do you think there's anything else that publishers should consider perhaps about the peer review process? So if more data set, thinking about machine learning and, where the data sets might have come from and what parameters might have been around the collection of that data, do you think that changes perhaps the peer review process? Or should it?
So I've been working a lot on transparency, specifically transparency about the data that's used in AI systems, and doing also kind of user research on what different people in the pipeline need to know about the data within AI systems to be able to do their work well, right? So if you're a developer and you're using a kind of pre-trained model, but you don't know anything about the data that's been used within it, then you're a bit stuck for answering all of those kind of more substantive questions about responsibility. And so there's kind of a proliferation of sort of standardized approaches for transparency in terms of how you, like which data sets you've used in your research, etc. And so I've been working on a data standard for machine learning contexts. It's called Croissant, and there's this data standard is kind of trying to cover as many different areas that would be needed by different users, including sort of data labeling, all kinds of annotation. And then this is then machine readable, so it's kind of in a tabular format that can be interoperable across many different contexts. And then so there's a little bit of a precedent set by, for example, a very big computer science conference has said, we encourage everyone publishing at this conference within this certain stream to make use of this standard, basically, so that any of your data sets can then be kind of discoverable and can be sort of assessed by anyone else who might be reading your paper. So I guess that's a potential precedent. I'll leave it there.
I don't think there's too much to add between those two answers, but again, just being upfront about, okay, these are the standards we would like to see across the board, so maybe like raising the bar a bit for what you're expecting from researchers to be able to provide from a transparency standpoint. I think that could be super useful, whether it's how they used AI in their research or how they were using AI when they were actually writing the paper. I would be interested in your thoughts on that. How comfortable you feel about that kind of use. And then another key piece, at least for researchers, is applying for funding. And whenever we apply for funding, we have to typically include some kind of ethical or greater societal impact statement. And I wonder if bringing something like that into the publishing and submitting process for researchers' work could be useful. I think sometimes journals and conferences already have clauses like that saying we need at least one paragraph, but maybe making that a bit more clear and upfront across the board could be a useful mechanism to get researchers to properly think through and again be more transparent as they're sharing their work.
I went to a conference the other day where people were talking about this kind of exceptionalism about AI in the sense that there are very often sort of roles dedicated to ethics about AI, and there aren't necessarily kind of those same things dedicated to the ethics of kind of other areas, not necessarily, I mean sometimes there are. And we were having a kind of discussion about, okay, in an ideal world we just don't need this exceptionalism anymore, but we kind of were thinking maybe we still kind of need it, because of some of the things that I saw on the screen earlier about kind of AI being pushed and pressured and hyped and these kinds of things. So it's that opposite force, right? I thought that was an interesting argument.
The need for ongoing balance.
Balance,
still.
right, yeah.
So the other, I think, big strategic question that that publishers are thinking about is whether they should license their book and potentially journal content to LLMs, and be curious to know sort of what you think from a data governance perspective publishers should be thinking about and potentially worrying about when thinking about, you know, whether it's a good idea to do that, and what are the longer term sort of implications perhaps from an ethical and a fairness perspective, because obviously you know, we don't know where this is going at the moment.
I guess, like, as a PhD student, sometimes I'm like, am I actually, I guess, knowledgeable to answer this question? But for this one, I would just be curious to hear what the authors would think. Like, I'm thinking about if I were in their shoes, if I had a research paper and then was asked by a conference or a journal, oh, hey, can we use your paper to then, like, plug it into an LLM to be training data? I'm not entirely sure what I would say. Maybe would I have the option to be able to take it back, like give my consent maybe for 1 or 2 years, but then in a few years' time, who knows, maybe the research has gone out of date. Maybe they should actually be using higher quality research by that point. And one thing I think is important in this is this new subfield called unlearning within the LLM domain, which is a big challenge with respect to, okay, if we're training these large language models and then fine-tuning them on more specific tasks, what if there are bits of knowledge and pieces that we actually need to retract and redact from these data sets and from these knowledge bases? And that's something I'm thinking about in this kind of space. What would that look like if you had given your paper up, but then you actually needed to take that back? Can we do that? Are there mechanisms for that? And that would be something I would want to make sure that there would be governance mechanisms in place.
I think that's a really important point. Tiarna, have you got?
Yeah, as a researcher, I think we always want more data. We're very data hungry people. The more the better. Kind of, I have the same sort of opinion as Mackenzie. As someone who writes papers and publishes them, would I want my paper just to be widely available and be used to train models on? I think probably not. I think at the moment we are all kind of products. I don't know if you see Meta recently has like quietly updated their terms and conditions to say that everything you post on Facebook and Instagram will now be used to train their AI. If you haven't already, please try and opt out of that if you don't want your data to be used. But I think we're already kind of product enough. And I'm not sure that I would be comfortable with my like work and my data being used any more than it already is.
Interesting. I think that might be a good point to open up the floor to questions. So, any questions for the panel? Ian.
Insight, really interesting panel. My name is Ian Mulvaney, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the British Medical Journal. As researchers, here's a question. I've been really fascinated by tooling that can automatically generate research papers and do so even with analysis of data sets like CDC data. So the results that they come out with are not made up, they're not fake, they're actual grounded analysis providing new results, not very interesting results, but nonetheless new results. Do you see a horizon where these tools become competent enough to generate useful results? And if so, what's your perspective on authorship and whether those results should be contributing to the scholarly record if they are actual grounded new data points or increasing our understanding of reality of the world? And what does that mean for scholarly authorship in that context?
Can I clarify the question just to make sure?
Yeah, so if LLMs get competent enough to do real research,
yeah.
What's your view on, should that be admitted to the record, and how does that change your role as you would think about it in the future?
Yeah.
Good question.
I mean, I don't consider myself as a first-year PhD student to be quite the right person to answer the question. Although I do think that the like systems as tools point that you made earlier on is a relevant one here, in the sense of that in practice tool won't surely be writing a paper as such. And then it's a question of like, how do you understand the decision-making process and how do you pick that apart? We do something, this is kind of a big leap that I'm making here, but at the ODI we do something called data ecosystem mapping. So how can you map out the different kind of responsibilities and flows of decision-making within a system? And so that would be where my head would go in terms of starting to unpack that.
I guess where my head went was human AI teams and human AI collaboration, which I guess is very much like what would that look like in an actual research setting. And I think if an AI system was able to take real data and formulate helpful results, whether or not maybe they would be what we as researchers would spot or things that we think were most important would be another question. But again, I think, yeah, at some point in time, I think that will become reality, and I think that is currently a reality in some cases as well. But I would be curious to hear like what kind of people in the room would think about this, just in a sense of so much of the work that we do is becoming researchers, and as PhD students is figuring out how to do research. So I think I just would want to make sure that we still have the chance to do that as people, and then farther down the line, use those tools when maybe we need some more creativity or if we're reaching a dead end. But I don't want researchers to be so reliant on the AI systems in that case. That would be my concern there in the long run.
I would agree. I think, firstly, if LLM has written a paper, I don't think it should necessarily be credited as an author, because I think an author is kind of a sentient being. But I think whoever in these like human AI partnerships, I think it should be up to the people to say, hey, we didn't write this, which is kind of a slight difference. I also agree that the whole point of, for example, doing a PhD is like learning how to be a researcher and training and learning all the necessary things so that you can go and advance your career. And I think you miss out on so much of that by relying too much on a model to do even your writing, for example, because once you leave and you have to write something by yourself, you won't have the practice. So I think that even though there can be human AI partnerships, it's important to keep it balanced.
So I just was curious if we made a distinction between frontier, foundational models and private models, for example, sponsored by a closed community or a society. Would you feel differently about your content being used to train that model? And as a follow-on, if that model was then freely available to you and your colleagues to use and to benefit from that training?
Okay, I guess you're asking for my personal answer. I have an example. So during COVID, it was millions of patients' data we used to train this algorithm called Q-COVID, that was used to predict whether or not people should be shielding, right? And no one was asked about this. The NHS said, since we are treating you, we have access to your data, we technically own your data, we can give it to Oxford University to train this algorithm. That was in theory for the public good. So I have no idea whether my data was in this data set, none of us ever will. But I feel better about that being for the public good than if, for example, OpenAI, that's a private company, were to take my data and do the same thing. And Google's trying to get into medicine, Facebook's trying to get into medicine, so Apple. And so I feel a lot better about it being used for public good than I do by a private company. Am I happy about it being used at all? Probably not. But I definitely feel better about it being, for a better cause.
I think that was an interesting nuance that you brought in between the private company versus, I don't know, let's say a society who would be much more, I guess, civil society. And yeah, I think I would have the same intuition that I'm a bit skeptical of the big tech firms, so I probably would rather not give my data up to them. But if I was able to give my consent to begin with, then I think I would have a conversation with myself, I guess, thinking about, okay, would I want this? And I guess it comes back to what would the application be? What's the end goal? I think that's, for me, like, what is the application? How will it be affecting people? Those are the kinds of questions I would want to consider.
I think we have, this is probably our last question.
I think it's probably a fairly similar question. Have any of you ever published open access?
Sorry?
Have you published an article open access?
Oh, yeah. Open access.
Sounds on open access.
Have
No.
you published open access?
Sorry, have you published open access?
My understanding is that as part of our doctoral training program, we have to publish open access, and we have to have a very good reason not to publish open access.
Yeah.
A follow-up question then relates to that. That is then open and accessible to teaching these models. You're essentially making that free and available. And you've just kind of said you'd be concerned about your content going into there, and it then gets to that conflict of you need to publish open access, but actually you want it to unlearn because these models will be able to come and learn off that content that you've put out there and published open access. So just your thoughts on that in terms of expressing the concern at not wanting to feed your information into these systems, but then the conflict that will create for you as researchers in making your content accessible?
There's a bit of a question of responsibility, right? So I guess in one case the question was more about, I guess you were asking considerations for being a part of developing a system. So actively as a publisher, for example, suggest, or maybe we're talking about a second question that we answered actually. But my thought was a kind of like ethics of invention question, in the sense of if you don't have any agency over which tools are built, that's one question. And then I would think about the ethics of building, being a part of developing certain tools as a separate set of responsibilities. So yeah, I just...
It's a tension, isn't
so
it?
it's a question of whether you would even start to think about that as an author if your work was just available in the public domain and it was kind of legal for that work to be used. It doesn't seem that necessarily falls quite at your feet. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think this is one of the problems of being a researcher and being at our stage and trying to build your career, is that you want people to read your work and you want people to have access to it, but at the same time, once it's on the internet, everything that's there is accessible to anyone for any purpose. So I think I don't work so much in policy, but this is one of the things that I like to think about. What can you reasonably expect when you publish something on the internet? If you're, like most people, if they're posting something on Instagram, they want it to be for their friends, not for Meta to train their models. If you're posting a paper or publishing a paper, you want it to be for your intended audience, not to train an LLM. So I think these are sort of things like responsibility, like you say, of what can we reasonably expect our data to be used for when we put it on the internet.
I think that's probably a conversation that's going to run and run within our industry, but I see we're up to time, so if you join me in thanking our panel, it's great to have you.